right, so hi there to Mr. Raw XXX. So again, right now we're streaming across Facebook. Phil Baggins, hi. Thanks for joining the stream. LinkedIn, YouTube, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram. Hello, Fortnite God. So again, we're here to talk about China, specifically working in China, and maybe why you should care. There's lots of, for those of you who maybe haven't thought that much about working in China, I've worked here for 15 years, and part of what we're going to be talking about is, first and foremost, why you may want to consider working, or at least working with Chinese organizations, and that partly has to do with why China is the future, to a certain degree. I'm not saying that any other countries are not the future, but say I'm American, and I've worked in China for 15 years, and I think what we see a lot of the time is that China is growing in influence. Not everybody's happy with that, but we have so many big companies that are dominating. Huawei was dominating telecoms before they were blocked in the USA. DJI is one of the biggest companies in drones. Battery technology, we see that being more and more brought under a lot of Chinese companies. Though, of course, Taiwan is pretty strong in some of the technical fields as well, too. And then, of course, just manufacturing in general. Previously, it was low-cost manufacturing, but now we have China really taking the lead in high technology. They're leading, some might say beating the USA and other countries in AI, though that remains to be seen. The point is, China is a big part of our world. They're going to remain a big part of our world. And one of the questions I have to ask for you is, are you ready? You don't have to create a career in China like I have, but will you be ready as a professional, as a worker, to work with China, to work with Chinese companies, Chinese agencies, because the country's going to keep expanding, and there's the technical skill sets that we develop, whether it's you're in marketing communications like I am, whether you're in a technical field, whether you're in sales or business development. However, unfortunately, there's also the EQ aspect in terms of you have the emotional intelligence to work across cultures. It's not that easy. It is, to a certain degree, a learning skill. Nobody is just able to do it. And so with that in mind, let's jump into today's topic. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the stream. But my background, which apparently is a bad background for this, but I've worked 15 years in China across many different cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. I am business fluent Mandarin Chinese. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it does mean that I can basically more or less communicate with government officials, with CEOs in Chinese. I have and can manage teams, mainly in the Chinese language, though, considering I focus on helping Chinese companies go overseas. There's, of course, some people that speak English, but not all. And of course, I'm currently based in Shenzhen. It's not one of the most well-known cities like Beijing or Shanghai, but again, it is rather prominent in terms of how fast it's growing, how fast it's been propping up and building up, I should say, the Chinese tech industry. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of China, working in China. And for that, I want to go over to, let's see if I can share this, because I think I finally figured out how to share something, because I have a wide screen, so it tends to mess up the presets. So let's see if we can this. So for those of you who don't know, there is, I previously last December last year, I did a interview with Max Chernov. He is a YouTuber. We talk about expats around the world, and there are some points that I wanted to talk about in terms of some good bullet points in terms of what you need to know. So let's take a look at this.
If you try and block China, you aren't competing with China. And China, whether you agree with them or not, they are going to be a big dog when it comes to a number of industries, including tech. Their companies are now going to be able to compete with the companies we have in the West and outside China. And so if the West and other countries don't have a plan to deal with that, as opposed to, oh, China has too much innovation, let's stop them from importing EVs into our countries.
It doesn't make sense.
Then your companies are not going to be innovating to match that. AI is another example. So I think one of the real challenges, the real risk is if you try.
So that, I think, is the crux of my point, is that China is going to keep coming. And one of the things I've seen previously, maybe in the last 5 years, is I've seen a lot of, say, Chinese companies that are based in the USA, and they don't want to just hire any local professionals. They want people who maybe can speak some Chinese and have a weekly call with the HQ, or who better know how to work with Chinese companies. And so it's similar to when we talk about, do you know how to work with AI? AI is going to be a big part of the future. To what degree, we're not sure. But people who know how to work with AI, the same way that in the past, people who knew how to work with Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, people who have those skills, and in this case, I'm talking about how to work with Chinese companies, those people might be able to get some of the better jobs, but we'll see. So in addition to just being able to get more career opportunities, working with another culture is actually very good for expanding your own worldview. It builds a lot of, say, important skills in terms of you're able to see different points of view. You're able to work with people from different backgrounds more easily. And anyone who's worked in a larger organization, there are so many different cultures, even in one organization, between different departments. And so being able to think more quickly, being able to adapt and be flexible is a very important skill, not just when you're young, but throughout your entire career. And also it makes you more competitive, I think, because when employers say, oh, they can work in this country, they can work, if you say learn Chinese, they can work in this language as well. It certainly makes you more appealing, and it's certainly a better story to tell on your CV. So those are some of the pros of working in China. And hold on, I think we have one more comment. All right, so thanks for the comment, Jonah. Again, coming in from LinkedIn. And he says, this is exactly why I want to come. China will lead the world in the next 100 years. All right, great. Thanks. That definitely mirrors my own thoughts. And I would say that I'll go back to another point I often say. Hi, Alexander Harris. Thanks for joining on YouTube. If you have any questions about anything about what I'm talking about, if you hear something I said you'd like a little more context, just feel free to drop it in the chat. If you have any questions about working in China, about, I would say to a certain degree, China in general, let me know. But I have lived and worked here for 15 years. Today, we are going to be trying to stay a little closer to working in China and working in Chinese environments with Chinese companies. Pros and cons. So I'm not going to be simply saying China is wonderful, China is great. I like China, but it's you have to understand both sides, I think. So again, back to the chat. We just talked about some of the pros. China's the future. It's really great to expand your worldview by working in a different culture, even if it's just for a few years. And of course, I think overall working in Chinese organizations can make you more competitive. Obviously, if you've worked with a big, well-known Chinese organization, for example, I previously worked with Huawei for 4 years earlier in my career, and that certainly helps when working with Chinese organizations. Everybody says, hey, it's Huawei, we want someone who's worked there. But I think in general, even if you don't work for a huge organization, there are many benefits. So again, if you have any questions, drop them in the stream. Let's move on to some of the cons of working for Chinese organizations, because there certainly are some. So first of all, the stress can be higher. I think that on one hand, if you're working in the tech industry, I work in Shenzhen. Shenzhen has well been heard of in terms of the 996 culture, though officially that's supposed to have stopped. 996, for those of you who don't know, is where they work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And that, I never actually had that when I was at Huawei, for example. But there were some cases, because really what it comes down to is that oftentimes, not all Chinese organizations and not all Western organizations in China, but what will happen is it'll be like, oh, have you gotten the project done? Have you gotten the results? Many people, many bosses will not take kindly to you, say, oh, well, I'm working from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. At 6 p.m. I'm going now. At least in my experience, that won't be very far. So, for example, I have a few examples I can share with you. For example, I remember one time early in my career at Huawei when I was in one of the global PR teams. We would support a lot of executive speeches, communications, and Ren Zhengfei, the CEO and founder of Huawei, had been giving some speech at Davos. And so I was part of the PR team that was supporting the team that was translating his speech. And because of the time difference, we more or less were like in the office, the translators, the PR team, the editors, and we were waiting until, what was it? We were like, we didn't know when they would get the Chinese version of the speech that was checked over after it was given to then give to us to translate, edit, to check for PR issues. And so we ended up waiting till 11 p.m. It's 12 p.m. It's 1 a.m., 2 a.m., all the way till 5 a.m. when we finally get this document. We get it done, we get it checked, we get it sent out. That's very extreme. When I was at Huawei and also at IFA, when we were doing global product launches, preparing for these in the weeks upcoming, it wouldn't be unheard of for you to maybe work till 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Though again, that's very not standard, and it depends on the department. But the point is, there can be stress from more work at times, and of course, there can also be stress from, how would I put this? Just from, you have to work in a new culture, possibly with a new language around you, and it's not something you're going to be used to. It's going to create more stress. The brain is going to have to be adapting, trying to be more flexible to these new things that you haven't done before. So it's natural. There also may not be as many open opportunities. So one of the things I suggest you do is, here, let me share this with you. Is that one of the, like, I don't look for jobs right now in China myself. I kind of been doing my own consulting work, but I see lots of posts from one of the people I follow. And so you definitely should be following some recruiters that have good insights, because one of the people I follow her name is Miriam. I might try and pronounce her last name. She's from Germany. And so he always has lots of, I think, good insights. So I would definitely say follow Miriam if you're interested in potentially working in China. So another question from Jonah. Is it basically continuous? I assume you mean that, is it like the longer work hours? In my own experience, which is not the same for everyone, is that, again, since I work on product launches, it would be much more intense around certain deadlines, the same way that the reason I generally don't go home for Christmas working in Chinese organizations is because if I work in PR, marketing, comms, the end of the year for Chinese organizations is when everybody is preparing their final reviews, the leaders are getting their final New Year's speeches prepared, and there's this really big, lots of deadlines around, say, the end of the year. So that's when another deadline, product launches. It really depends on the organization, but in my experience, this not going to be, unless it's like this really small, owner makes their own rules, government doesn't regulate them, which again, I'm not going to say that's common, but it does happen sometimes. But unless it's that kind of organization, then you're not going to have this crazy, you have to be in the office until 9 p.m. every single day. That being said, instead, there are I have seen certain organizations where the boss makes it known that, oh, the only good employees are the ones that are in the office till 9 p.m. But again, that's not that common. And if you're going to be employed by a Chinese organization, you're not necessarily the same standards are going to be applied to you. I mean, you never know. There's good companies, there's bad companies in overseas China. You just have to be aware that there certainly can be more requirements in terms of how long you're expected to be in the office at certain times, but it will vary, and it's one of those things you want to double check on a company by company basis. So back to this, definitely check out Miriam, and she's been making lots of posts recently about how there's just not that many job opportunities for foreigners, or at least in terms of what the recruiters are seeing. And that's partly because of the pandemic. It's partly because there are more companies that are localizing their efforts. And so it may go back and forth. We're having more companies say, oh, we want more Chinese employees, but then they may go back in the future and try and get more foreign employees, because some of the things that Chinese companies still have issues with is how do you localize for the overseas markets? How do you cross cultures? Because at least in my experience, that's one of the issues that is very hard for them. And it's something that I'm not even sure AI can really help them with 100%. So it's simply that, at least from recruiters are seeing, there's probably not as many jobs. So maybe harder to find something. Another con is there's going to be limits to how far you can climb. And this is not something bad about Chinese companies. It's simply how companies work with people from their own culture and from without their own culture. You may or may not know that, say an American company, because I'm American, people that are not American, they're not going to be able to climb as high as Americans can. It's simply how it works. Like if I was an American to go work in a German company, I can't be the CEO, or I probably can't be one of the really senior people because I'm not going to be German. But again, you may not care about that. Another con of working potentially with a Chinese company is that you may not be able to change and pivot as quickly as the organization does. That's similar to if you're in a senior position and if the company decides it wants to go from A to doing B, if you're really senior, you can't necessarily find a role within that new direction. The same way that, if you're coming on as a foreigner, you're coming in for one job, basically. Maybe you're going to be an editor. Maybe you're going to be a social media manager. Maybe you're going to be a business development manager. So just to be aware of. I think that those are some of the main pros and cons I've experienced. If you have any questions about that, feel free to, again, any questions or comments about anything I've talked about, working in China with Chinese companies in general, feel free to let me know. What do you want to do before you start? And again, I'm not going to be talking to you as a recruiter. I'm not a recruiter. I don't want to be a recruiter. And so I'm actually talking to you from my experience in terms of someone who has not only worked in China, managed teams, projects, campaigns in China, and also I've had to hire people for my teams while I was working with Chinese companies. So a few things. What do you want to do before you start? Well, first off, I would say, is it a good fit for you? That's the key thing. Do you have the right soft skills, a high IQ? Because maybe they're not hiring you for that, but that will really determine, I think, if you can fit there long terms. For example, I have a good case study that I've had once where I remember when I was at Huawei, and the design team had found someone from one of the really big Western smartphone companies to come on and help them redo their design for the Huawei phones. And I won't say which one it was from. It could have been Ericsson. It could have been Apple. It could have been Samsung. I don't want to spill the beans or anything. But the point is this person came on board and they were more or less saying, okay, I know the right way to do it. The company has hired me for my design expertise, and I'm therefore going to tell them what to do, and they're going to listen to me. And that did not go very well for them because they I heard from various Chinese colleagues that there was lots of screaming, yelling, and crying around I'm not sure if it was on the phone or whatever, but it was a very big culture clash, country and well as organizationally, because they weren't able to cross that cultural boundary. Another thing to consider is, where do you want to work? Do you want to have a new adventure? Do you want to try working for any Chinese organization, or do you just want to work in Shanghai or Beijing to have that expat lifestyle? Because I'm sure there's definitely positions, there's definitely companies, Western companies or Chinese companies that may want people to come over to Shanghai or Beijing, but where you're willing to work, what type of companies you're willing to work for, will determine how many potential options there are for you in terms of working with Chinese organizations. Now, in terms of, do you have the right skills and experience? First and foremost, it does vary, or it can vary based on how much your skills you have, but I think it's 2 years is more or less the experience cap. If you don't have 2 years of experience, it can be hard to get a visa. Another thing is that a lot of companies in China are looking for kind of sales, business development positions, because they are very sales and business development focused, from all the way from small size to the medium size. Large organizations, when they have corporate teams, they can focus more on marketing and branding. But in terms of a lot smaller ones, sales and marketing is generally a pretty core requirement. Technical skills are in demand too, but that's not really my area of expertise. And then, of course, you can forget more or less about low-level and entry-level jobs. Say anything, unless it's like really specialized where they need a native speaker for a certain market. Anything that's entry-level, they're going to find a Chinese person for it, especially because most foreigners would not be able to take what they would pay a entry-level Chinese person, and therefore they're not going to be willing to pay potentially double or triple that. It really depends on the area. So, any questions so far about before you start looking to work in China? Any questions? Just on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, X, and Instagram. Feel free to drop them in the stream, and I'll get back to you on that. But for now, when we're talking about what to do when you're looking to get a job in a Chinese organization, is the first and foremost is you need to reframe your value proposition. Now, what does this mean? This means that one of the big challenges, not just in terms of, say, overseas / Western professionals working in China, Chinese organizations, it's also for companies that want to cooperate with Chinese organizations. And that is what and I'll say the West because I'm an American, but it could be for countries in South America, in Africa, in Asia, that these all apply. What we define as success doesn't necessarily equate to what the Chinese organization defines as success. And so one of the things I see a lot is a lot of professionals on LinkedIn in the West, we often talk about how we're XX strategists, or how we are this expertise in this area. But for example, Chinese organizations often focus less on strategy. They care a lot less about strategy, say for talent, but also for agencies. Everybody's trying to sell them strategy, but they're never going to buy the strategy. And I've experienced this firsthand when I've had to source a lot of agencies to cooperate with the Chinese teams I've led. And so that's kind of the first thing to do, is you have to kind of really think about, what is the value I bring? But do the organizations in China share that value? Because really what it will come down to is, if you want to work in a Chinese organization, not just get the job, but meet targets to make them think you are succeeding in the role, you have to be succeeding according to the standards that they set, which is, again, not always the same thing. For example, I've heard this from multiple people, but let's say you're brought on to increase the marketing for a company, or you want to build a brand. Now, what, say, a professional like me might, or like you might hear is, oh, I need to increase the brand image, or I need to increase the marketing results. But what the CEO or what the directors might be saying actually is, we actually want to increase sales, and we want to increase sales quickly. And so, two different languages, and there can be a lot of clashing in terms of what you think wants to be done and what they actually mean. So that's something to be aware of. When you're looking for a job, a lot of people ask me about job listings. I'm not a big fan of job listings. In my entire 15 years in China, I've never gotten a job via a job listing. For example, let's see, my first job in China got through LinkedIn contact. When I worked for Huawei, I found that through a recruiter. After that, when I worked for a year with one of the Western agencies to work with one of the smartphone companies, I actually reached out directly to some of their executives on LinkedIn, I think. After that, when I was working in Hong Kong, doing some fractional consulting during the pandemic in 2020, I got that through a personal contact that I made from my time at Huawei. After that, when I went to lead media and influencers globally for Vivo in 2021, 2022, that was through a personal contact I made. So as you can see, again, it's not necessarily the same. So I see your question, Jonah, and I will get back to you on that as soon as I finish that. But I'll tag it up there so I don't forget. So, so job listings, you can certainly use them, but I would definitely say don't think you're going to get a job from. You might, but it's not. There's going to be hundreds of resumes, so it's not the most likely. So definitely look at salary surveys. So let's check this out quick. I'll show you this. Where is it? Stop sharing. Sorry, this is only my second live stream, so thanks for your patience. I'm still figuring out how to get some of the stuff. So we're going to go over here. And when I say a salary survey, these are actually really useful tools that a lot of the recruiting agencies put out. And you can get them as a manager or a job seeker. They're all fine. But, for example, you can look at Michael Page. You can look at, I'm not sure, Robert Half, that's her Chinese name. Robert Walters. Morgan McKinley, Robert Walters, Michael Page. I think these are all pretty good. And what it'll do, it'll show lots of different industries, and you'll be able to go look through each one. You'll say, okay, not only what are the types of positions that they've seen people looking for, but maybe what are the salary ranges. And again, this isn't all inclusive. It's always best is if you can make a good connection with the Chinese organization and then sell them on your skills, and they might make a position for you. But it's certainly, I think, very helpful in terms of understanding what might be available and what the salary ranges might be. And again, I would say unless you're very, very, very special with lots of experience, don't count on a expat salary. Thanks, Jonah. I appreciate that. I've just gotten that out of the way. So let me respond to Jonah's question. Can you go deeper on why strategists aren't marketable in China? All right. So in my experience, again, this is looking kind of at some of the bigger organizations, Huawei, Vivo I've worked for. Oftentimes, strategy or at least plans for the future are done internally. When I was at Vivo, they had, at least I remember specifically, they had like product planning groups that would plan all of the things they were going to do for upcoming product launches. And so there is not the, what am I talking about? There's not the, sorry, I can only think of the Chinese word Xiguan. There's not the, this is what happens when you learn another language. Sometimes you just can't think of what to say. But the point I'm trying to make is that in Western countries, at least, there is the people are used to maybe paying agencies or consulting professionals to give them advice. What should our strategy be? How should we position ourselves? Whereas in China, the way agents, there's not so much of a, you want to look at what, I'm sorry, I'm just getting caught between languages. It's much less common for Chinese companies to rely on consulting advice. I mean, one of the things you might hear from smaller company CEOs is like, oh, I'm the CEO. This is my company. I built it. I don't need a company to tell me how to manage it. But again, it depends from company to company. But oftentimes what Chinese companies do in terms of working with agencies or outside consultancies, it's more about execution as opposed to telling them what to do and how to do it. I'm sure there's companies that would take consulting advice, but you'd have to have a better relationship with them. And so that has been my experience. Okay, Jonah, to follow up on your second question, and I'm loving how I can just paste these questions into the stream. So I'm using StreamYard in case anybody's interested. They have free plans, but they also have, again, this is not a paid ad, but it's just very, very useful to use. So executives, because my experience, Jonah, is that executives in China make the decisions themselves about things like strategy, planning. That being said, to certain degrees, they are willing to take advice. So, for example, I've had companies, CEOs ask me about potential services for say, helping them doing their marketing planning. But in terms of, say, the company direction, in terms of the product, in terms of things like that, my experience is they do it in-house themselves. That being said, if they bring someone on board internally, maybe a product expert, because they're certainly willing to bring on Western product experts or design experts to supplement their team, they might use that advice to then, along with their own gut instinct or their own skills, to then create a strategy. But again, in my own, limited experience, I can't say I represent every foreigner who's worked in China. I have seen that they're less willing to consider strategy. And this is something that many Western agencies, in my experience, just no problem, Jonah. They fail to understand. They keep trying to pitch this without understanding that this is not necessarily what the Chinese companies are going to buy. So again, I love the opportunity to talk with you all. If any of you have any questions about working in China or even living in China that might relate to work, drop them in the stream, whether you're on LinkedIn, YouTube, X, Instagram, or even on Facebook. So let's continue about looking for a job. I've talked about don't rely on job listings, check out salary surveys to try and get some information. I would say try and connect with people beforehand. You can try and connect on LinkedIn, though again, it's going to be less common that smaller, medium-sized companies will have executives or CEOs on LinkedIn. But at the same time, you might be able to go to events, to exhibitions that might be held in your local country. For example, there's IFA held in Germany every year. There's CES, that might be harder to get into for the average person. But the point is, there's always going to be events and exhibitions held overseas that Chinese salespeople, Chinese executives might be attending. That's always a potential way to introduce yourself. And another interesting thing that has been on my mind recently, I'm not sure if you saw my previous live stream on Red Note, but I'll keep this short. But after TikTok was almost banned, and it may still be solar banned, we saw a lot of former TikTok users flooding over to another Chinese app, Red Note, called Xiaohongshu in Chinese. And we saw them connecting with people, learning about China. But we also saw a few people maybe posting about, oh, I'd like to get a job in China. And people might have seen them. So you may want to consider, if you really want to work for China. And again, I think it's a good idea. I think it's going to be very important in the future. And you could just work for China for a few years, then go back to a Western organization, then partner with Chinese organizations. There's many ways to go about it. But think about branding yourself on Chinese social media. Here, let me see if I can give you an example. I haven't done a video in a while. I need to do them again, but I haven't. But for example, if I open this app up here, here's my Xiaohongshu account. And so, for example, I've created a bunch of videos. And so, if you say, for example, what is this Chinese speed? So I just create some videos there. And so, again, I'm speaking in Chinese, but you can also speak in English or your own native language and kind of use AI to do Chinese subtitles. It doesn't have to be perfect, but get your name out there, because you can't just rely on job postings if you want to work in China. You can't rely on recruiters, because smaller and medium organizations aren't necessarily going to want to rely on recruiters. I've worked with several organizations before where I've been trying to hire for my team members, I'm trying to hire team members for my team, and they just weren't. The HR department was not willing to consider recruiters because they charge money. What is it? It might be like 20% of an employee's annual salary. So if, let's say, you come to work in China, maybe you're making 300,000-400,000 RMB a year. I forget what that is in USD. But then they might have to pay 100,000, which would be. It feels nuts to some HR that aren't really experienced with these, looking for higher end talent, or at least foreign managerial talent, because they think, oh, what's the cheapest, as opposed to, if you don't go through a recruiter, oftentimes it takes much longer. So oftentimes the recruiters will be posting the job boards, or maybe they'll be looking on LinkedIn. But the point is that make yourself visible. If you don't have any skills relating to China, you might want to start learning. I don't think you need to have fluent Chinese or even really good Chinese to work for a Chinese organization, but it can help. So let's see. That's just kind of, I'll talk through a few more points, but I think before the stream ends, I do want to try, and it's going a little bit longer than I wanted. So if anybody has any questions, drop them in. I want to do this an hour. It may go for an hour and a half, but again, if you're happy to watch, I'm happy to talk, ask any questions if you have them. So I will simply say, in terms of looking for a job, just be aware of a few things, such as if you get that job offer, it may take a few months to actually get everything done in terms of the visa process. So be aware of that. Same time, be aware that the contract you sign initially is not the official contract, because you'll have an initial contract that you sign which may just be in Chinese only. So be aware of that. But at the same time, you may then that will be used for the visa application, and there'll be an official contract you sign. I'm not 100% sure exactly why it's done that way, but that's more or less how it's done for all people coming into China for a visa. So you got to make sure everything stays the same. I think more or less Chinese companies can be trusted, but there's always going to be, whatever country you're in, there's always going to be some untrustworthy companies, so you have to be aware of that. Maybe today I won't talk about what do you do when you leave a Chinese company, because there's a bunch of roadblocks to be aware of there. But we're going to move on to the next topic, unless anybody has any good questions. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to working in a Chinese organization, and this could be whether you're based in China or it could be whether you're based overseas, because there are often lots of Chinese expatriates sent to overseas countries to work with the local hires. So working in a Chinese language environment. So this is starting to change, I think. At least a few years ago, I remember them being able to use AI translation tools and messaging systems. But I remember when I worked at Huawei, Vivo, all of the computer messaging and I would just say all the systems you use for your daily work oftentimes might just be only in Chinese, because they may never had a foreign employee before. And you might have to deal with that. You might have to deal with a lot of stuff on your computer being in Chinese. You have to navigate around that. Can you use AI to do translations? Can you learn basic Chinese for some of these key phrases and menus that you see every day. Contracts that you sign with HR. It may be changing, but in my experience over the past 10, 15 years, a lot of times they're often in Chinese. I think there was one company I worked with a few years ago that actually had English and Chinese contract. But in my experience, I feel old now, but because I'm about 41 years old, but I've seen just only Chinese contracts. And so for me, I've been able to kind of read through it slowly or have a Chinese friend look at it, but it may not that easy for you. So you need to have a plan about how are you going to deal with that. And oftentimes for documents, HR will not want you to take it home, but you may need to find a compromise. Also, this is not the China of 20, 30 years ago. There's no one that's going to be your secretary. Even if you're coming with high-level skills, you're getting paid a really high salary, no one's going to be your secretary. I have a really good story from when I was at Huawei, because one of the things Huawei used to do, I'm not sure if they still do it, was that Huawei would find these technical experts. Maybe it wasn't AI at the time, but it could have been a number of fields, and they would pay to bring them on board, and they would pay them lots and lots of money. It was kind of nuts. And then you would hear these stories about this technical expert who was writing white papers, who was giving presentations to the company, and he can't speak any Chinese. His boss can't speak any English. Most of the team can't speak any English. And so they have these weekly team meetings, and he can't attend because he can't speak any Chinese. And so there's like this one 24-year-old new hire who speaks English and Chinese, who is more or less his handler. Not his secretary per se, but the point is that you should not expect to have someone always be at your beck and call. You may have someone be assigned to help you out. It may not be their job. And so one of the key things that comes is that if you're going to work in a Chinese language environment, in addition to needing translation software, and you have to understand that there are going to be limits to who you can talk to. And that you're going to need to create allies, people that you can create okay relationships with, that are willing to take time out of their own schedule, away from their own work, to help you out. Maybe there's ways you can help them. Maybe there's some mutual arrangement you can bring to. But this, again, if you're working for a Chinese organization, this is not going to be like the traditional expat lifestyle where if you are a Westerner sent to work for a Western company, it's less this nowadays. But still, it's easier for them to say, "Oh, help me do this." You have to be willing to find ways to convince Chinese people to help you to get around. Because if you just sit in your own space, in your own bubble, you're not going to be very effective in my experience. And of course, if you're working for a very fast-moving company, it's going to be even less likely that people can take a lot of time out of their day to help translate something. So be concise, be friendly, try and help others first so they're willing to help you, things like that. Before we move on to results from relationships, again, thanks for everybody who's on the stream right now. If interesting, when I look at live viewers, it's mainly listing people from YouTube, Facebook, as well as X. Maybe it's not listing LinkedIn, but I do see Jonah is here from LinkedIn, so it's possible it just doesn't show that. Give me a second. I'm just going to take a quick look. I'm just curious to see if, we have 5 attendees on LinkedIn as well, too. So it's interesting that it is not, it's interesting that it's not showing that in the live stream. Anyways, wherever you're from, whichever platform you're on, I'm happy to have you here. We're going to move on to results versus relationships, which is, we talked about what Chinese companies expect a little bit, but we'll get into a little more detail. So one of the, even for someone like me who's had a lot of experience working in China, it can be difficult to really understand whether to focus more on kind of building relationships, taking it slow, or to jump in and try and get results fast. And it is going to vary across organizations. You need to have conversations with multiple stakeholders to understand this better. But, and this is, I think it's a good point to go back. Oh, hey, Simon. I wasn't sure if you'd be attending. Let me see what you've got here. So, all right, let's see. Often people face challenges when working in Chinese companies and pushing back or saying something can't be done, even when it's clearly impossible. Ooh, yes. This is a fun thing because, and again, keep in mind when I talk about Chinese companies, I'm not saying all Chinese companies are like this, but I was actually going to make the point just now that I was talking recently with someone on LinkedIn about how, when we say cross-cultural communication, I remember like 5-10 years ago, the standard would be, there's this red and blue, like Westerners are this way, Chinese are this way. But it's not that way anymore. There are differences between North and South, West and East. There are differences between provinces, differences between cities. There are cultural and behavioral differences based on where someone maybe graduated, where people worked. Like if they came from a really fast-paced Amazon style or DGI style, win at all costs, no matter who you screw over. Not my words. Or is it more of a laid-back style? And so you often have to understand the specific culture of the company, the department, the boss, and it could vary. There might be small changes. So now on to Simon's question. Hold on, I just gotta drink coffee. I'm still not 100% used to live streams. It's been about 15 minutes so far, but hey, I enjoy talking to you all, so I'm glad to be here. Luckin, it's cheaper than Starbucks, and I can't taste much of a difference, to be honest. So, sorry, Simon. Your question, often people face challenges working in Chinese companies, pushing back what's impossible. So, this is always a challenge because oftentimes when Chinese companies are, say, going overseas, they don't know what they don't. Maybe they say, we need to have this done, and they say just go and do this, and they don't really understand will it work or won't it work. When we do media influencers for product launches or for general media comms, they'll often say, hey, we want to review the video and give the okay before it goes live, and we'll say, but you're not paying them for this. This is an earned review or earned feature. We're not allowed to tell them what to say, and some people will, or some executives will take that rather badly. Same thing happens when maybe there's a negative media review about something, and so then take it down, and we're like, but we can't do that. And so sometimes there is no real way to bridge that gap. Oftentimes, I think it's better to say, we'll try our best, and we'll talk to them, and we'll see what we can do, and then we try and come up with a compromise. But one of the things to be aware of is, I think when, at least in my experience, if you have a very more specific example, Simon, let me know. But I often find when they push back or they want something done that's impossible, it often has to do with reputation, with crises, with things like that. And that is something that really comes down to maybe the executive in question feeling threatened. Maybe if they, even when I was at Huawei, we would have executives unwilling to talk to the media or key influencers, friends of the, as much as they can be friends of the company, because they're worried of the minute chance that something might somehow go wrong and they might somehow get noticed in a bad way by upper management, which would then affect their career development. So there can be a lot of fear, especially when thinking about how things work overseas, because a lot of Chinese companies, they see a lot of the anti-China rhetoric coming out of the USA, other countries. They don't understand it. They just see China doing really great things, and they see people trying to target China because of it. And so when it comes to fear, I think it's best to try and have more of a connection to say, well, hey, we understand this is maybe worrying, but here's how we can help you navigate this. It's not necessarily going to get you the right response or get them to, I don't want to say calm down, but to get them to accept it. But part of what happens, I think, in working with Chinese organizations is you have to, some are willing to bridge that gap and some just want things their own way, which to be honest sounds like American companies. But I think that really is what it comes down to, whether you're, say, like Simon, who is working for an agency, I assume working with Chinese companies, or whether you want to work internally, is that, and ideally this is something you can find out a little bit about before you start working with the company, is that you have to understand, try and understand or try and have conversations about what their expectations are. And is this something that can actually be met? For example, if you're hired to build a brand for a company and they just want a really big sales increase in 2 or 3 months, that's obviously impossible. There's no way you can actually meet that target. So sometimes you never want to give them the direct, no, we can't do that. But I think it's always best to be a little bit more roundabout and kind of really say, well, hey, here's some work we did for a competitor of yours or for another company but in a similar industry, and here's how we help them do it. And here's how that process works, because it's never good to say no directly, especially in Chinese companies, Chinese bosses, especially where other people can hear you say it, because any direct no's or roundabout no's are always best done, not face to face. Best if their team's not there. Give them opportunity to say face, because it's very possible that if this person is saying, "Oh, do this thing that's impossible," they may not have any experience overseas. They may not understand how the overseas market works. They may be sales focused, and they may be used to just telling people to do something and it gets done. So I hope that answers your questions. If you have any follow-ups or any more specific examples, just let me know. Yeah, business culture in China can be tricky, not necessarily because it's China versus the West, but because it's very, very specific, because it's basically who the CEO is, what their experience is, what the company culture is like. You have to understand all of that, and it's not even that easy internally. I've been in multiple Chinese companies for, taking something that takes a month or two internally working at the company every single day before you start to understand, okay, which department has the power? What does the CEO really want? What are the key skills of the internal teams versus what they need to improve? So it does take time, and I can sympathize with you, Simon, working with an agency, but because it's much harder from an external perspective to try and get that knowledge you need to better help and serve the companies. It's hard internally as well too, but that's one of the interesting things. I think that's one reason it's a fun challenge, and it's a very important skill set to build too. So the stream is going to be going longer than originally intended, but that's fine. Let's talk about balancing results and relationships. So first and foremost, sometimes it's a bad idea to try and really charge and get things done as soon as you come on board right away. There's that Chinese saying that more or less equates to the nail that stands up gets hammered down. And so I would say that it's difficult until you're there for a few weeks or a few months to really understand how the internal politics work. That could include, as I mentioned before, who is the power, what are the actual requirements on your boss, your department. One really good, I think, example is when I was working at one of the smartphone companies. I won't say which one, because I've worked with 3, one on the agency side, 2 internally. And and there was one time where we came on board, and this is something that is not necessarily uncommon for a company that has many Chinese companies have built their business first in China, then they expand overseas. Not all, but some. But it's often that the domestic team will have more power, more prestige. They'll be the ones who have met the targets, who impress the CEO and top directors. And so they'll have all the trust. And what happened in one company was it got to the point where not only did they have all the trust, but they were trying to hamstring the overseas department to a certain degree, to the point where not necessarily they would just completely block them, but I think it was at that time the overseas department was new, and every single, I think all the designs or all of the consumer data, all this stuff was done by domestic teams, and they wouldn't provide PPTs. They would only provide PDFs, and so you had to just create all this stuff from scratch. A bunch of stuff like that where, and I'm not even sure why this predated me. It predated some of the bosses I had, but it was just, it was very clear that no matter what you did, domestic or overseas, you had to cater to the key people on the domestic team, the China team. And so I didn't know that when I first came on board, but it was one of those things where even your Chinese boss, your Chinese boss's boss, doesn't want to tell that to you directly. They're not going to come up to you on the first day and say, "Oh, by the way, look out for the domestic team. Don't say anything that will piss them off because they might make things harder for us." That's something that you find out slowly, and maybe as people figure out, "Oh, you can be trusted. You're part of our team." They'll kind of give you a few tidbits, or they'll share a little bit of information. That probably is true in Western organizations too, but that is my experience in Chinese organizations. So it's also important to understand that bringing in a foreigner, and this, I think this could, my main point is for foreigners coming into work, but since I know Simon works for agencies, this could also be for if they bring in an overseas agency to help them expand into a new area, is that anytime you bring someone new in to do things in a new way, in a Western way, it means big changes, and not everybody is happy with those changes. I think this is natural, but it's also something that if you want to build a long-term relationship, whether from an external consulting company or agency or internally, you have to take that into account, because one of the things that you'll find as a foreigner working with Chinese organizations or working within Chinese organizations is there's a Chinese phrase, "太麻烦," like it's too troublesome, and you will be troublesome as a foreigner or as a foreign company, but you don't want to be too troublesome, because as long as you're helping them get them what they want to do, execute what they want to execute, and you're not giving them too much trouble, then that can help delay any complaints. Because what you don't want to happen is multiple people talking to top executives about how this company or this person is causing lots of problems. So it's just something to be aware of, and this, I'm sure this will happen for, say, Western companies if Chinese employees come over to them and try and start doing all these new things. I mean, this is sadly just how companies work, how people work. And so it's also important to remember that the goal of bringing in a foreigner, or the goal of working with a foreign agency, is not necessarily to make a company more international. So that's something to be aware of, because they often want to, okay, how do we hit our target in this market? Or how do we handle this crisis? How do we improve our marketing communications? How do we increase our sales? But they don't necessarily want to be international. There's actually a story about Lenovo. They actually expanded a lot by purchasing part of IBM's computer business, I believe. But what they ended up doing is they ended up copying, from what I remember, IBM's business culture. And I think what happened was to the point where their internal culture was very international. And I think it actually, again, from what I remember, generated a lot of negative feedback in China because everybody, I think, was more or less saying they were kind of betraying their country by being so international, which again, these are not everyone, but this is some of the negative comments they got. So just remember, if you're working with or working for a Chinese organization, it's going to be composed of Chinese people with Chinese culture, with Chinese thoughts, desires, and needs. And your goal is to help them get results in a specific area. It's not to transform their company. I mean, unless they tell you that. And even if they tell you that, just because the CEO says that, doesn't mean everyone else agrees. So just food for thought on that point. So again, figure out who wants you there, who doesn't, who has the power, where your overall team department stands, who you need to kiss ass to. Sorry for the language, but that's kind of simply how it works, because it doesn't matter how great your skills are. If you can't fit into the organization, you may not be able to stay there. I remember one great story from my time at Huawei where what they did is my team worked with translation teams for executive speeches, and for whatever reason they decided to try out, we want to hire Westerners with fluent Chinese to translate these documents. And I remember one person they hired who, again, was like completely fluent. It was much, much better than mine. Mine is fairly fluent for business purposes. And the problem is that even though he had some of the best Chinese I've ever seen, and he was great at translations, he had the most horrible bedside manner that I have seen among most of the expats I've ever met in China. Like, he was always like, anyone who had was a different opinion than his, he would call them out, curse them out in front of everyone, the team heads. He didn't care. And it got to the point where they just forced him out after a while. I mean, it wasn't too quick because a big organization moves quickly, but it was just like, he had the best Chinese, the best translations, but nobody wanted to work with him. He was just too much of a bother. So just be aware of that. Also, another key point is be aware how the company grades success, because especially if it's a new area, if they've never done marketing before, if they've never done branding before, they may have no idea, which means it's much more likely that they might change their minds halfway through. So that's definitely a question that you want to try and get an answer to, whether you're an agency, whether you're internal, and just again, you don't expect to get 100% straight answer, but it's one of those things you want to, through conversations, try and understand what the internal stance is. And again, like working for a company overseas, there's no 100% safe guarantee, but it's always important to try and get more information so you know exactly what you'll be walking into. Again, when it comes to relationships and results with your boss, I would say, again, it's more important what they say to you one-on-one than in front of the team. See if you can, over a month or two, understand what their boss wants, because what their boss wants versus what your manager has told you may not be 100% the same. So it's always a good idea, make your boss look good. Don't embarrass your boss. If you have any embarrassing questions, if you need to say no on something, don't say it in front of the team. Certainly do not say it in front of their boss. And I mean, this is simply not just how corporate environments work in general, but it's also how China works to a certain extent. So if you want to work in China with a Chinese company, especially in a bigger Chinese company, you need to know how to play politics. You need to know how to play nice. You need to know how to kiss ass, grovel when appropriate, especially if you actually have fucked up. Just be aware of that. And so, a lot of topics we've talked about, a few more. I appreciate the comments we've gotten from Jonah, from Simon. We have a number of people still in the stream across X, across LinkedIn. So if you have any questions while you know about this, feel free to let me know. I'm always happy to get a question. I think it makes the stream more interesting. Though I will say, I'll take a quick break. If you have any further questions, you can connect with me on social media. So if you're wanting to connect on YouTube, TikTok, actually Instagram, you can connect under the name I've listed up there. It's Sean _China. And I'm generally always happy to chat, whether publicly, whether it's a DM, no worries on that. If you're interested in connecting business-wise, again, just search my whole really long name on LinkedIn. You could even probably search Sean _China. It'll probably work on LinkedIn too. Again, always happy to chat more, ask some questions. I hope we do more live streams in the future, so feel free to let me know if there's any more specific topics you'd like to talk about. And I'll see if I can get this done more concisely in the future. But going back, I think Jonah has one more question. All right. So from Jonah, I'm really loving how I can just paste these comments into the stream. That's really great. Thank you, StreamYard. I presume you've worked in the West. Is corporate maneuvering and its importance more important from China? So I actually have not worked in big corporate environments in the West as much. I've worked for one Western corporation in China that was the one of the Western agencies, but it was still in many cases Chinese. But yeah, I would say corporate maneuvering. Let me think about that for a second. Corporate maneuvering might be more important in the West in terms of career advancement and your own job, because at least in bigger corporations in China, especially if you're hired for a specific purpose, there's not really anybody on hand to replace you, really. So there is a certain amount of, I'm not going to say safety, but more safety, I would say. But when I talk about corporate maneuvering in China for a Westerner, I would say what I mean is more about, how do you get the support you need to do what you need to do to get your job done. Because when it comes down to it, at least for me, when I have been working internally in the past, it's not just about, make the boss happy and that's it. It's about, okay, I want to have results. I want to be able to attain results that I can then show to my next job, whether it's a year, 2 years, 5 years in the future. Because oftentimes, in my experience, people don't get hired based on what companies they've worked for. They get hired based on what results they've attained for previous companies. So, and again, everybody has their own standard. Maybe I've known foreigners who just want to take things easy, just do a job and just go home at the end of the day. And there are certainly positions in China that can work for. But from my point of view, from my own prerogatives, I wanted to be attaining things, and it's much harder to attain things, to achieve things well, if you are not taking into account the internal corporate environment. I remember there was one big brand campaign I led the PR for, and one of the fun things was that it was mainly for product PR and product branding, but it was also relating to, there's also potential risks on the global stage that we had to deal with, which means that I had to, and my boss's boss had to do a lot of communicating with the corporate PR team, which was run by the one of the domestic departments. And so we had to have lots of meetings. They had lots of demands, even though they weren't leading the project. They had lots of demands, and because they had more power, we had to kind of do lots of work with them to try and we had to proactively find them to help them meet our schedule, to draw out processes so they were happy with how something was working. And that's one of the things, is that why it's important to understand who has the powers, because even if you're in charge of something, it may not matter to someone who actually has the power. And therefore, you have to be willing to kowtow. You have to be willing to try and make people happy. Because if you don't have the power, if you're in the minority power-wise, you always have to be trying to not necessarily meet people's needs, make people happy, but you have to be willing to try and play peacemaker, not to rile them up too much. So But again, that's my own thoughts on that. So thanks for the question, Jonah. Any other questions before I move on? All right, so let's see. I talked a little bit about working with your Chinese boss. I'll add a few more points. And I think that, and again, you can't necessarily find this out during the job interview, but you can certainly try and better understand it after you come on board. And that is, you know, how much latitude you have with your boss in terms of doing things in a more Western way or something like that might have a lot to do with how secure they are in their own position. So, for example, have they just been in the company for 3 to 6 months? And if that's the case, then they may not be that stable, which means you may not be that stable. Or at the very least, you may not have any latitude to do things in a different way or to suggest different ways to do things. If they're, on the other hand, if they're friends with the CEO or friends with their bosses and bosses, whatever, then it may be more acceptable, or certainly may be easier to try and do things in a different way. But again, it's always important to try and understand what your boss wants, what their bosses want, try and have more one-on-one conversations. And you also need to be aware that they may not be used to taking no for them. I mean, they may be a nice person, man or woman might be a great person, but the way people think about leadership in China versus overseas can be quite different. So be aware of that. A few things I'll talk about. And again, any questions on working in China or any related questions, feel free to drop them in the stream. Thanks for joining and Simon for your questions so far. Anybody else watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, or Instagram, feel free to let me know. We're talking about like the right and wrong ways to act as an expat. And so I think first and foremost, I'm going to plug someone right now. Let me just face up China. All right, where is it? There we go. So, if you are interested in working in China, a good resource that you might want to check out, let me share this quickly. Is the China, this is not as good as could be, but the China Flex podcast started by meeting Francis Kremer, I think, in Germany, and they have lots of really good interviews with people, foreigners mainly, but also some Chinese in terms of their work and their life in China. So, and one of the things I'm involved in is I've been working with another guy to kind of help with the membership of the South China FlexPat. Just having some coffee meetups. We're having an event later in March, I think. But the idea, and this is me paraphrasing, the idea behind the FlexPat is it's a new take on what expat means, and the idea of expat, whether you say expat or how expats have traditionally acted, can be relatively negatively received in China because a lot of Chinese workers often see that expats come with more privileges. They're not only paid more, maybe that some of them in the past got free allowances for the kids to attend the very expensive international schools. And then, of course, they have more privileges in terms of they're much more directly connected to the foreign HQ than the Chinese staff could be. And so, and of course, we've always heard lots of negative stories in China about the privileges or the privileges maybe foreign workers or expats assume they have, whether it be to, there's always that story that I remember of Chinese workers, I think it was expats in Shanghai taking a big table onto the subway station, having some banquet there and pissing off the locals, whether it be during the pandemic where they refused to adhere to Chinese law and get the same testing for COVID done, whether it's just thinking they have more rights than the average Chinese worker does. And that can really piss people off. And it's bad enough if you're in a Western company in China. It's even worse if you're working for a Chinese company inside them and you're kind of acting in a kind of a proud or in a way that says, oh, you deserve to be listened to, you deserve certain privileges simply because you're foreigners. There's going to be enough enough people are going to be annoyed without you acting like an arrogant jerk for you to add people. So let me actually go back to, so again, if you are, if you are interested in learning more about Shenzhen and my life in Shenzhen, definitely take a look at Max Chernov's YouTube channel. Let me just go down here. So I did an interview with him. So yeah, wait, there's a part 2? I didn't realize there was a part 2. Apparently he published a part 2 and I have not seen it. Anyway, so there's part 1 here, 500,000 UDA, and then of course there's a part 2 which I have not watched. Anyway, I talked a lot about my life in Shenzhen, so definitely take a look at that. But what I want to show you, short, where is it? Let's look at this one. This is good.
Can I say bad words on your channel?
Sure.
Don't be an asshole is the key thing. One of the things that really ticks off the locals the most. Let me preface that by saying, you know how we've had a lot of issues with hate and violence against Asians, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in the USA. Whereas people say, oh, I don't like this country, therefore I'm going to take my anger out on people who I even think are from that country. That doesn't happen here. I mean, people maybe are unhappy with the anti-China policies of the USA, but I've never really seen them take them out on Americans. I've never been targeted because I'm an American. But overall, I would say that I feel that China is much better in this respect. They're much more welcoming, though at the same time, there are expats who will take advantage of that, and they will think that the Chinese are too timid. They won't fight back. I can do whatever I want. Can I say?
So that's a good snippet there. So that's the key thing, is that there's a number of things to be aware of if you're going to work in a Chinese company. And unless you're specifically told to hit this target, get these results no matter what, it's always better to err on the side of caution, I think, when it comes to trying to fit in, trying to do things more the Chinese way. And again, back to what Simon had said. Simon had given the challenge of doing things that are impossible. Is that there's different interpretations of what the right way is to do something. And so, for example, a company will oftentimes think meeting sales targets are more important than 100% adhering to, say, USA, Europe, Asia market guidelines. Or they may think like, oh, there's a gray area. We don't need to 100% meet that, or we can just do it until we're caught, then we'll change. And when it comes to working in China, there's no malice here. In many cases, there's no intent to defraud overseas consumers, but it's a different way of thinking about things. The way many companies have developed in China, or at the very least, many of these executives or bosses have developed in China. It's all about who moves fast wins, who moves slow loses. And I think we can all see that in terms of how, for God's sake, look at DeepSeek. We're still 100% sure exactly how they did it, but I mean, look how much the U.S. stock exchange went down just at the news that they likely have done this in terms of beat out ChatGPT, or at least I haven't looked at recent news. But as a professional working inside a Chinese company, you have to be aware that the right thing, the moral thing, the ethical thing may not be viewed the same way as you view it in your own country. And I personally think that for many companies, it's much better to try and go halfway at least, and to slowly have that internal education, because they're not doing it because they're bad people necessarily. It's just they that's how the company culture here is. You have to grow really fast. You have to do things as good as possible. I've heard people talk about DeepSeek in terms of good enough innovation. And so that's another thing you should think about. Can you walk that? I'm not sure if I would even want to say morally gray area, because we're talking about sales and product development. But I've seen a lot of things happen, or a lot of people that maybe want to do things halfway, and some of the issues you can solve internally. You can have conversations. Some things you have to try and do. It's good enough, and then hopefully help them change in the future. Another question from Jonah. Really appreciate it, Jonah. I'm always happy to share my own experiences, and if people continue to like these, I'll keep doing these live streams. But yeah, I mean, it's this is what life and work in China is like, at least in my own experience. And I think that it's good. It's a good experience for everybody to have, because it really can help you learn and grow in ways you didn't think you needed to learn and grow. I certainly wasn't as flexible or as open before I worked in Chinese companies. And so, for me, starting 10, 15 years ago, there were lots of my own assumptions that I had to challenge, that I had to look at. But in any case, that's my perspective. We're talking about expats. Yeah, that's the main thing is that you are a guest in China if you decide to work in China. If you're working inside a Chinese company, you're a guest in that company. And so act like a guest. Don't shit on the floor. Don't badmouth the hosts. Try and help, offer to help. And understand what they want done. Understand what they really want, not necessarily what they ask, because what they ask and what they want is not necessarily the same thing. Yeah. Let me just take a quick stretch here. It's been an hour and a half actually. So, all right. I see we got a number of people still in the stream. Any questions about working in China, about Chinese companies? Any questions about companies I've worked for, Huawei, Vivo, stuff like that? Yeah, so this will be I have petered out in terms of the topics I want to talk about. So any questions at all you want to ask, feel free to paste them into the chat. I assume it's still working. Oh yeah, thanks to Mr. Raw XXX for the subscription on YouTube. Question from Jonah. Can you speak more on the morals and ethics and the degree to which those are disregarded for other ends, i.e. profit, market share, next quarter's earning report? Part of why I want to leave the West is that I'm not going to be expected pressure to violate ethics laws. Oh, well. So I love China and I love working in China, but China is not perfect, and it shouldn't be viewed as perfect. I think that one of the things I've heard about with the Red Note conversation is that people were seeing all the Chinese people's lives on Red Note, but Red Note is a subset of the Chinese population. It's not all Chinese. And so there's lots of great things about China, but if you're going to work for a Chinese company or work in China, especially for a corporation that is a profit-focused company. There's not really nonprofits in China, at least by Chinese companies, or at least not very many. In terms of violate ethics and laws, I'm not sure if I would say they pressure you to violate ethics and laws. There's certainly going to be short-term targets. That's how companies in general operate. You don't have to be on the sales team for a Chinese company. If you want to work for Chinese companies, you don't want the short-term pressure. Definitely don't work in sales. Don't work in business development. You may think about working for a bigger corporation. In my experience, there can be less pressure, especially if you're marketing your comms or other areas. They're they're not necessarily directly connected to sales, as in if the sales don't meet their monthly or their quarterly target, that isn't necessarily tied to the work you're doing. That being said, I can't speak for all companies, just the ones I worked for in the past. In terms of morals and ethics is a tough issue because there's actually an interesting discussion on this. Let me see if I can find this on LinkedIn. But we should not assume when we talk about morals and ethics, we should not assume that what we mean by morals and ethics is interpreted the same way in China. Let me see if I can find this conversation on LinkedIn. Hold on. There it is. By one sec. Email Martin talked about this. What did he say? All right, let me share this quick. And again, any questions, just drop them in the stream, YouTube, LinkedIn. I'll get them when I can. This is more of the Q&A section right now. So let's stop share, present the screen. There. So if you can see this, Gabriel said recently a discussion with the foreigner on LinkedIn. So he shared the problem, which is so better a century of tyranny than a day of anarchy. And the point is that, like when we talk about tyranny and anarchy, the way China is often viewed overseas, it's like, oh well, they're authoritarian, which makes them bad, but this also talks to the Chinese focus on having a stable society, and so they, again, in my experience, they care less about, say, democracy than they care about being able to have a stable system. They want their country to grow, to prosper, etc. So, I mean, Chinese will think about things in different ways. So, I think it's much better, Jonah, to think about, how much pressure you want on yourself working for a Chinese company, and how much you're willing to not do everything in line with the best practices from a Western point of view. That's actually, I think, something that's a much bigger issue, because it is much more common to not be like, you can't go into a Chinese company, or at least most Chinese companies, and say, this is the right way to do things from what I learned in the West or in another country. And that's not necessarily going to be accepted. So another question. Again, anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the stream. Another question from Jonah. Let's see. Which of these are present in China? Typical misleading advertising. Well, what country doesn't have misleading advertising? High pressure sales tactics. If you're talking about selling to consumers, or if you're selling like B2B selling, I think for B2B selling, it's mainly that they don't know how to communicate across cultures. So oftentimes it sounds high pressure or very direct, very aggressive. But it's hard if you take how you sell in one language, in Chinese, and you try and directly translate that to English. It's not just about translating language; it's about translating the culture. I mean, and that's why we see that if there's any Chinese companies that do ads for overseas markets, or even ads in China, and then how they're perceived overseas. There was that one commercial by, I think it was Tilby, the washing machine company, where it was a really, really, from a Western point of view, a really racist ad. But what happened was, they had a washing machine. There's this hot Chinese girl that walks by. There's this black guy covered in his clothes are covered in paint. She pushes him in, and then she puts the Tilby washing machine pod in, and then she takes him out. It's a very light skinned Chinese boy. So that was, again, that's one company, one marketing team making that decision. But again, it's one, I think it's just bad taste marketing. It's also a cultural issue. price gouging, bait and switch tactics. That's a lot of very, very specific questions. So I'm not necessarily going to have seen all of those. I mean, data exploitation. I mean, I think all social media companies in the West do that in terms of getting as much data as they can. In terms of what was the other example I was going to give you? Is that what was it? Oh, it's very common for Chinese companies to try and give discounts all year round, but so it's not really a discount. Just they will market the product, say, oh, the original price is say $400 or $600, and then no, it's discounted to $400, but it's always $400. So again, it's definitely can be interpreted, and I've seen it interpreted by Western consumers as like misleading advertising. That kind of certainly happens, though it's also this a certain way that Chinese companies will operate. So I'm not sure how Chinese consumers feel about it. So I mean, like I said, China's not perfect. A lot of Chinese companies well focused on sales, maybe sales first. And some are willing to do things in a better way, I don't want to say more Western way, but in a way that Western targets, whether they're consumers or businesses, are more willing to accept, and and some aren't. I have a really fun case study that I can share with you. When I was brought on board one company to lead or help the PR team, and we were looking at influencers, right? And we wanted to build up influencers in this area. And what happened was, apparently, in addition to the PR team being responsible for influencer relations, the CEO had randomly decided to, to give a user growth team the same authority to go and chase every single influencer. And what they had done is they had used some very bad sales tactics in terms of just using cut and paste messages, offering really super low rates, just being very rude. And before I even came on board, most big influencers in the entire industry, I won't say which industry, were not willing to work with the company. So they blackballed us before we had the opportunity to work with them. So that definitely happens. But again, I would not say that's a Chinese company thing. I'd say that's a specific boss and specific company culture thing. So there are issues that come from bad company cultures and bad bosses. And it's certainly helpful to know which companies might have more Amazon-esque, because it feels like a lot what I've heard about Amazon in the USA. But some don't necessarily. So that's why we say when you're trying to learn about Chinese culture before working in China, it's all well and good to learn the basics. But when you're going to be working for an organization, it's going to be about the boss's culture, the company's culture, not necessarily a very broad Chinese culture, which can mean many different things to many different people. So I hope that answers your question. So again, this is just a final note. China is really fun, really interesting. I think there's lots of opportunities, maybe less opportunities now for foreigners, but if you're really interested, I think there's ways to work with China. But just don't take anything you hear in the media, on social media, with a big grain of salt, because there's one camp that says China is a paradise, it's wonderful, it's great, it's the best thing since sliced bread, and there's the other camp that says, oh, they're the worst thing in the world, they're worse than the Nazis. Whereas the truth, is in between. So I think I err more towards the China is really great. We just misunderstand them. But yeah, there's bad bosses, bad companies, bad company cultures everywhere. And so part of this talk is to help people to kind of understand some of the basic things they should be thinking about, but also some of the things to consider before they accept that one offer. For example, if there's 7, 8 different rounds of interviews before you're given an offer, maybe that's something you should be concerned about, especially if it's not like a super senior CEO role. Maybe they can't get their plan right. Maybe they can't agree on what the requirements for the role should be. Things like that. If they can't tell you how the position will be graded or how the results will be graded before you sign a contract, maybe that's something else you should be aware of. But at the same time, changing the way we think, because you can't just think of doing things the Western way or doing things the same as your own country, and you have to be able to figure out, can you accept a different way? Again, we're not talking about breaking laws. I've certainly had certain cases where I said, okay, we can't do that or we can't do that. And I don't know that many. I mean, obviously, since part of the work I do in PR and marketing is risk management and crisis management, part of what I have to deal with in some cases has to do with if a company has done something that really does them really bad in terms of public opinion or the media, or have they actually violated certain local regulations or certain local laws, and how do we handle that from a PR perspective, from a crisis management perspective, in addition to what the legal team is doing. So again, all companies from all countries, I should say, make mistakes, do bad things, but they do good things too. So just don't think that China is going to be either a wonderful paradise where nothing goes wrong. Don't think it's going to be a horrible wasteland where everything goes wrong. There are opportunities, but you have to make the opportunities for yourself. You have to build relationships for yourself. You have to build your reputation. You have to be able to find a middle ground between the perfect way and what the company initially says they want, as Simon had that good comment on, in terms of sometimes you might be asked to do impossible things. And so, and what oftentimes you may have to deal with is that it's not uncommon for Chinese agencies to make these promises. Those promises do yes, 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 no matter what. And if they lose the business, they'll just find someone else. And so it can be hard in that environment to have to deal with, well, they're telling you this, but this isn't actually what is true or what can work. And so it's tough, but you have to have those conversations. You have to be willing to have those difficult conversations with the bosses or with your boss at least, and try and find the middle ground. I remember one really fun story where one team I was working with under the marketing team I led was they had some Chinese agency writing blogs. And I was like, okay, well, let me take a look at this, because there are not a lot of things I had to change in the company, or at least to help them update their marketing. And this Chinese agency was just taking 1,000 RMB for every post, and it was just absolute trash. It would have been better if they just had AI write it. And I was like, oh, well, okay, well, we need you to have a foreigner write this. And so, we have a foreigner write this. And I said, well, I'm a foreigner, and I don't think you're having a foreigner write this. They said, oh, no, trust us, we are. And I said, okay, let me talk to the foreigner so I can confirm this. And then we can't let you talk to him. And that was it. So we dropped them after that. So just be aware of that, is that it's much easier for Chinese agencies or even Chinese previous employees to make these promises, because sometimes, as Simon had alluded to, there is some people will just make these promises just to try and get business or try and get a job, and they're happy to move on afterwards. Whereas oftentimes foreign employees really want to try and do things the right way, as Jonah had alluded to in his comments. But the right way is not necessarily always easy to understand, partly because of cultural differences, partly because of differences in the way that the companies do things, the different markets do things, but also because they may have been given bad information before. So no matter what you do, you have to be willing to, in a Chinese company, kind of bridge the gap. You have to be willing to meet in the middle. You have to be willing to educate, because if you want to, in part, give them a new way of doing things or a new way to look at sales or marketing or something else, you have to be giving them that education, giving them those case studies, giving them those examples. They aren't necessarily going to just trust your words simply because you're a Western professional, a Western expert. So that's just an FYI. Any other questions? I still see we got still a bunch of people on X. We didn't have any people on X last time, so I'm happy to see all of you. Let me just double check X to see if anybody's making any comments, because I don't see any right now. Okay. Well, we have someone on who commented about wanting to listen to it later, but it's in the office. Yeah, so anyone who's listening, I will upload later. I think what has happened before on at least, I'm not sure about Twitter and X, but if you want to listen to it later, it should be saved on LinkedIn. So you can search for me, Sean Upton-McLaughlin. It's where is it? Down here, yes. Or you can look up YouTube, Sean _China, which is up here. And if you do that, you should be able to see it. As far as I know, my previous streams, YouTube is probably the easiest one because you'll probably have to find the event on LinkedIn. But if you just go to here, I'll even show you. So again, any other questions from any of you on X or on YouTube, LinkedIn, just drop any questions you have. And I think if there's any questions, I'll just respond to them after the stream as well too. So let me just, hold on, let me just open, let me just open this quick. All right, so if we here, share the screen, I'm just gonna go over to, so here's my YouTube channel. If you want to subscribe, feel free, and I try and do shorts when I have free time, and if I do more live videos. But just go over to Stateside China. These are a lot of past videos I've done, but I have a lot of shorts here, some which have been summarizing last live stream I did. Everyone's talking about China, but if you go to live, you'll see that currently you can see this one will be here for viewing, and then of course my previous one on the TikTok and Red Note situations here. So if you want to look at it afterwards, feel free to check it out on YouTube, but it should also be on LinkedIn as well too. All right, so again, an hour and 45 minutes. This is longer than I initially wanted to, but hey, if there's any questions, I'd love talking with you guys. But again, feel free to send me questions, DM or public questions on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, all are good. I'll give you guys a few more minutes. If any more questions you want to drop in there, I will let you know. Otherwise, in a few minutes, I'll probably be ending the stream for today. So I'm glad all of you were able to join. Again, any questions, drop them in the stream here or send them to me afterwards. And you can also watch the saved video afterwards as well too. So just give you guys a few minutes. Any questions? Life in China, working in China, working with Chinese companies. Just let me know. Oh, and also make sure you, here, let me plug Miriam again. If you're interested in working in China, definitely check out Miriam on LinkedIn. I always find her recruiter and employers working in China posts insightful. So she comes recommended. Also, if you want to work in China, definitely consider taking a look and signing up for the China FlexPat podcast. Again, a FlexPat is not the traditional expat. It is someone who kind of bridges the gap between East and West. Someone who, again, maybe not all the ways, but is willing to learn Chinese language, willing to learn Chinese culture, who is willing to try and build a bridge, as opposed to, as I've seen several times, a Westerner comes over to work for a Chinese company, and then they simply say, "This is my way," you're going to do things my way because I say so. And it is very arrogant. It certainly perceived as very arrogant. And, you know, expats can maybe get away with that to a certain degree working for Western companies in China, but there's going to be a lot less patience for that in a Chinese company, even in the case where the Chinese company cannot afford to let you go because they really need you. No one's going to be doing you any favors. And just to be aware. Any more questions? If not, I will end the live stream, but feel free to send me any questions afterwards. All right. In that case, thanks all of you to attending. If there's any other future live stream topics you're interested in hearing about, feel free to send them to me on social media. And thanks for attending. I hope you all have a great Wednesday if you're in China, Asia time, or a great Tuesday night if you are in America. And if you're watching this in Europe, it's the middle of the night, if you're watching this later, feel free to drop me any comments. So again, I hope you guys consider more about working in China, or at least working with Chinese companies, because China in many ways is a big part of all of our futures. So have a great day, guys.